Good morning, everyone. It's a real humble honor to have the opportunity to read a paper for Aldona, Jonaitis, who couldn't make it. She, as Ishmael mentioned, had an emergency that came up and couldn't be here.
Louder, please.
Certainly, before I begin, it's always a challenge for anyone to follow a great presentation like that, which Ishmael gave. It's a context that needs to be part of these discussions on Tlingit art. And for the people, we have artists, master artists with us today, and we have pieces here that we can say are art, but art is perhaps not the best description. A lot of these are moved. They bring a spirit and they bring power. But at this time, I'm here to read Aldona's paper. I do hope I can do justice to it as I read it. But her talk is entitled Amos Wallace, a Tlingit Master. And her presentation goes like this. Before this talk starts, I would like to apologize for not being able to attend the Juneau meeting. I dearly wish I could be with you all, but family concerns make it necessary for me to be in Virginia. I thank Zach Jones for being willing to read this paper. I also want to thank him for bringing my attention to the treasure trove of materials about Amos Wallace at the Alaska Heritage Institute archives. This paper, based on my research at the archives, represents just preliminary work on the materials generously donated by Amos's son, Brian Wallace. I don't know if I see Brian here today, but Brian has donated his father's materials to the Alaska Heritage Institute. If I've made any mistakes, please let me know by email. Aldona says I can give you her email address. So, she continues that Kwak of Vancouver Island are sometimes mentioned as one group on the coast that did not lose its culture after the devastations of settlement, that overly resisted the potlatch law, and that continued making art and hosting ceremonies throughout the 20th century. And truth, as you all know, the Tlingit did not lose their artistic culture either, with a variety of artists creating works throughout the 20th century, including master carver Amos Wallace, shown here as a child, reportedly on a parade in Juneau in 1928. I think he's making a good statement there as a child. The problem with any group who says, quote, losing its culture is that this notion follows the assumption of a binary system of civilized versus native, and a unified narrative of forward historical movement from native to civilized. That was certainly the perspective of missionaries and government officials in Alaska. In theory, at least during its early years, the A&B, Alaska Native Brotherhood, endorsed this as well. But the history of any Aboriginal group is far more complicated, with stops and starts, continuancies and breaks, inventions and reinventions, and interactions with others. There is no single history that embraces everyone, but many histories. One element of the history of Tlingit art includes, without judgment, that one accepts as legitimate and authentic art Wallace made for sale to non-natives. Amos Wallace, whose Tlingit name was Sta, was born in 1920 and died in 2004. In addition to his contributions to Alaskan art history, Wallace was an active and honored member of A&B and the Russian Orthodox Church. Member of Raven Dukdang Ton of Huna, he was taught to carve at age 7 by his brother Lincoln, who was only a year older than he. Together they made their own tools and crafted model totem poles. They also went to school in Wrangell, where they learned a great deal about Tlingit art from Horace Marx. Lincoln, I believe this is a piece by Lincoln here, became an accomplished artist and made this silver pin that appeared on the fall cover of the 1965 edition of Smoke Signals, a journal of U.S. Indian Arts and Crafts. Lincoln died in 1981. The Wallace brothers found a niche in an existing market for Alaska Native art, which was promoted by both the U.S. Indian Arts and Crafts Board, as well as the Alaska Native Arts Cooperative Association. In December 1938, a circular letter to teachers across the territory by Virginia Farrell, supervisor of this organization, wrote, quote, the sale of arts and crafts produced for the territory last year totaled $98,000. This is an important item in the economic stability of our Native people, end quote. Over the years, this letter, sales of Alaska Native art increased, especially during the war when many members of the armed forces purchased items. In 1945, there were over $200,000 in sales. After the war, sales decreased as the military withdrew from Alaska, but by 1950, they were increasing again in time for the Wallace brothers to find work. After serving in the Army during the Second World War in the Aleutians, Amos and his brother made numerous model totem poles and traveled to Seattle to sell them. They stayed there for 1 year, then lived in Portland for 11 years, and worked as an art wholesaler. In 1958, the year Alaska became a state, Amos returned to Alaska to fish. Around the country, numerous commercial ventures held special programs to celebrate this event. In New York City, the Abram and Strauss department store invited Amos to carve a totem pole in its Brooklyn store. He carved the new pole next to an older Quixote pole lent by the Juneau Nugget shop. During his stay in New York City, he was invited to be a guest on the Jack Parr Show, a precursor to the Tonight Show. During the show, Wallace explained that totem poles were not worshipped, although missionaries erroneously thought they were. Then he described the pole he was carving at Abram and Strauss. I'm making, and quote, in Amos's words, I'm making up an entirely new totem that's never been made at any time, and it will be something different in combining the symbols of New York, which will be the Statue of Liberty with Indian designs on it and a few people on the bottom, and a symbol of the Alaskan Indian, which is my tribe, will be the raven and the flag of Alaska and the salmon. End quote. The next month, he was interviewed by WNEW TV's Sandy Becker. In addition to showing his handmade tools, his carving tools, and commenting on a pair of partially worked totem pole bookends, he pointed to an older totem pole, which he once again asserted wasn't religious. At the end of the interview, Becker turned to the camera and urged his viewers to go to ANS, visit him. He will show you that this is the ancient technique. It's very beautiful to work, and you go visit him. An executive of that company was also on the board of the Brooklyn Children's Museum and planned to have the finished totem pole installed there. There's a picture here, another picture of him associated with it. And this pole is still in the Brooklyn Children's Museum.
Excuse me, Zachary, I'm sorry for the interruption. Is it possible to put the podium back so that the audience can actually see the visual things?
Yeah, if I'm in the way, thank you for letting me know that.
Actually, if we shut these lights, I think much better.
Much better.
Want to do it the other way? Can you turn off this one?
We can lower those lights there. Am I loud enough for folks in the back?
Yeah.
Oh, this is good.
There. I can do my paper, yes.
You can see
I have to
it.
get a little closer, but we can make it work. After all this media attention, Wallace noted that he was the first national Tlingit television star, jokingly. Quote, I found that somehow I was a little famous overnight. Calls and letters started coming in, people wanting me to carve totem poles here and there, end quote. In 1959, he was invited to carve a pole at Shillito's in Cincinnati. Well, this is a picture of the totem as it was exhibited in the Alaska State Museum. Here's the Cincinnati version, which went to the Cincinnati Museum of Natural History. All right, we got flashlights there. This was for the Oregon Centennial. In 1960, he carved several poles at Disneyland's Indian Land. They had an Indian Land at Disneyland. And in 1961, he carved one at the Boston department store pole Filines, which was then presented to the Boston Children's Museum. He also carved a number of poles in Alaska, including a 50-foot monument that today stands outside of the University of Alaska Museum of the North. According to Wallace, the size represents a foot for every state. Then in 1967, he carved 3 poles at what was then called the Alaska 67 exhibit, now Pioneer Park. 2 remain at the park and 1 went to Juneau. An article about this carving demonstration in the Fairbanks Daily News Miner in July 1967 points out the growing popularity of new totem poles and thus the availability of jobs for people like Wallace. It goes on to say, quote, the Juneau, Alaska man, a Tlingit Indian born in the small village of Hoona, always pauses in his work to answer questions about his special tools, methods of carving, and emerging figures on the big log, end quote. The article then quotes Wallace explaining the general meaning of poles. Quote, people are mistaken when they think the Northwest Coast Indians used to worship totem poles. The early white missionaries thought the same thing. They made Indians burn the poles without taking time to discover the reason for the totems. Actually, the totems were used more to fill the need for a written language. When a bargain was made or a business transaction, a pole was carved to stand as testimony to the transaction, end quote. In Juneau, Wallace had 2 totem poles in the federal building, one at the Juneau Douglas Museum and one at the Mendenhall Glacier Visitor Center. He also made a 822-foot panel for the Marine Highway Terminal in Bellingham. Wallace continued to work for many years, becoming a proficient silver worker. As can be seen from this slide of his masterwork, this is a fantastic piece. It's 3 separate pieces put together. Wallace had seen some crude silver pieces in a store and was told if he supplied some, the store would sell them. So he picked up a book about engraving and taught himself. Then he proudly proclaimed, I could teach my older brother. He also drew an immense number of designs on paper, which could serve as models for his other works. In an interview, he commented that he liked to develop new techniques because doing the same thing every day would be boring. For example, he holds up an eagle he made in 1964, saying, quote, nothing like it. Only 2 wooden ones were made, end quote. He also tried his hand at modernist prints such as this one on one slide, and working with the Seattle dealer Griffin's Alaska Wholesale, and he began casting his carvings. Painted black, they looked like argillite. Painted with colors, they would appear to be cedar. Today, one can still find a number of such casts on the internet, labeled in all sorts of ways, as well as in the collection of the National Museum of the American Indian. Wallace was also involved in Native American Merchandising Enterprise Corporation, Denver, where he tried to promote native carving throughout the United States. I'd like to conclude with some remarks about the so-called Northwest Coast Renaissance, during which artists like Bill Reed and scholars like Bill Holm reconstructed the canons of 19th century classic formline art. As Holm wrote in his 1965 classic, Northwest Coast Art, an analysis of form, he had not found any artists in the North knowledgeable of those canons. The notion that the canons, formal rules of composition and design, constitute the presence or absence of art, denies the basic function of any native art. To communicate concepts intrinsic to Tlingit culture. There was no question Amos, Wallace actively shared such concepts to the public, trying to educate non-natives on his rich cultural heritage and to correct misunderstandings that persist today. The problem with much art history on the Northwest Coast is that it adhered to the, quote, all or nothing, end quote, concept of culture. Either an artwork was traditional or acculturated and therefore inauthentic. Tlingit sculpture, painting, and textiles made during the first half of the 20th century, of which there were many examples, have been dismissed as pale imitations of glorious creations of 19th century art. Moreover, art made for use outside the community was judged to have been compromised or have its authenticity compromised. Unfortunate concentration on fidelity to earlier artistic contentions and accusations of inauthenticity have blinded some to the powerful cultural statements embodied in such works. Indigenous art, like the culture to which it is connected, is not lost. It transforms into something else that includes elements of the past and the present. Wallace drew from the artistic traditions of his ancestors, which he applied to artworks meant to communicate his culture to a new contemporary, often non-native audience. He also, on occasion, incorporated elements from his audience's culture into his carvings, such as with the Statue of Liberty atop the Brooklyn Children's Museum pole. On the screen, it is a comparison between Wallace's Bellingham carving and the Frog House screen. The screen embodies the northern Northwest Coast canon with its absolute precision of line, delicately curving surfaces, complex and symmetrical two-dimensional design. Compared to this, Wallace's work does appear less refined, less unified, less contained by a continuous form line. However, when we compare the same carving to this piece that was made before contact, they are not so different. Both seem to share similar qualities of line and form, the simplicity of surface decoration, the straightforward assertiveness of meaning, uncomplicated by complex visual elements. Here they're all together. Not one is better than the other. Each embodies the cultural and historical experience of its artist during the time he lived.
Collected by the Russians.
If one reads most of the literature on 20th century native art of the coast, in addition to the Waka Waka being the supposedly only group who, quote, maintained its culture during the painful years of the century up into the 1960s, one also learns the names over several noteworthy artists, such as Mongo Martin, Ethel Neal, and Henry Hunt. These were indeed good artists, and I do not have any intention of downplaying or disregarding their great contributions to Northwest Coast art. What I do intend to do is place next to theirs the impressive artistic contributions of Amos Wallace, Tlingit master carver.